What's going on? Today, we are going to be talking about risk monitoring and reporting. And most specifically, we're going to be talking about the risk register tool that we developed here at Better Everyday Cyber. So, let's proceed. All right, so what is a risk register anyway? So it's basically a tool that you use to document, analyze, or manage identified risks. And you're going to track these risks over time using this document so that you don't lose sight of it. And then you're able to use this document also to document what your established risk treatment plan is for that identified risk. So am I going to avoid this risk by stopping whatever I'm doing that is causing this risk to be introduced into our environment? Or am I going to accept this risk and say this is the normal thing that's going to happen and have to be in our environment if we're going to proceed and do business? Or are we going to do something like we're going to mitigate the risk and we're going to implement some protective measures, some safeguards in order to reduce the risk down to an acceptable level? Or are we going to transfer this risk to someone else like cyber insurance, to where now we just pay our premium, we pay our deductible, and then they take the bulk of a mitigation strategy if we were to experience a cyber threat, for example. Now, and then what we want to do also is we want to assign some points of contact, some owners of the activity that's responsible for mitigating that risk down to an acceptable level. So who's the point of contact? Who's the responsible party that's going to implement our plan of attack to bring this down and reduce the risk? And then lastly, we're going to monitor these statuses. So this risk register gives us the ability to monitor over the course of time how we are identifying, how we are mitigating, and then how we are seeing through to completion these risks being brought down to an acceptable level in our organization. And until they are, we're going to keep our eye on it, and we're going to make sure that we follow up and make sure that we implement that plan of action as prescribed or make the appropriate adjustments so that we can reduce risk. So let's talk real quick about the Better Everyday Cyber Risk Register template. So we created this to be a tool that SMBs can use for risk management. And we wanted it to be something that was scalable and easy to use because we want this to be accessible to people that may not have a deep and extensive background in risk management. But also we wanted to make sure that it was scalable to the point where even if you were an experienced practitioner, you could still find value in using this tool to be part of your risk management strategy in documenting those identified risks. It is customizable to where if you need to adjust certain fields, then you have the leeway to do that. It's flexible in order to accommodate that. And then it's something that can add immediate value to an organization. This is something that is, again, it's easy to use and it's something that is not costly. So it's a cheap solution. When I say it's not costly, it is free. It's a free tool that we provide to anybody that wants to download it. And also it's not something that requires an extensive amount of software or an investment into a robust risk management platform or GRC platform that may be out there that might cost you 4 or 5 figures to implement within an organization. So this is something that is just on a simple spreadsheet and is customizable, and you can come into an organization, especially those that are starting their security program. You don't need all those highfalutin whiz bang tools and softwares that have all the bells and whistles. You just need something to document your identified risks and then help you perform an analysis on those risks and then determine what your strategy is to implement a remediation plan. And then how long is it going to take, who you're going to assign to it, what resources are you going to allocate to it, and then when do you expect it to be completed. All that can be done on a simple spreadsheet, and that's what we created here. So let's use an example from the NIST Special Publication 800-53A to run through the risk register to show you how it works. So let's talk about control AC6 or access control 6, which is the control that talks about least privilege. The principle of least privilege boils down to this: you get only the privileges, permissions, that are necessary for you to do your job role, nothing more. We're going to zero in on one particular aspect of this control requirement. So, personnel or roles to which privileged accounts on the system are to be restricted is or are defined, and then privileged accounts on the system are restricted to those personnel and role. So basically, the permissions and privileged accounts that are on the system are assigned to specific roles. We identify those specific roles and they get permissions that are aligned directly with that role. One way we can determine if this control is implemented is by doing the assessment method known as an interview. So we're going to interview the Chief Information Security Officer, simulate that, and then show you what the response was based off of the question we're asking. Okay, so the question is, how does your organization ensure that users only have access, privileges, and permissions required to do their job roles? And the response that we got from the Chief Information Security Officer is access is assigned based on the employee's work role and department. Non-privileged accounts are provisioned with permissions based on the department assigned, which correlates to a security group in Azure Entry ID. And however, all members of our IT, regardless of their role, have privileged accounts in the domain admin group. Based on the response of the Chief Information Security Officer, we have the following finding. Privileged accounts assigned to employees in the IT department are not configured to have the least amount of privileges necessary to perform specialized security functions based on their specific job roles, because everybody is assigned to the domain admin groups, even though they do not need domain admin privileges for every single member of the IT team. Now that we have identified an area of risk, let's input these risk details into our risk register. All right, here is our risk register, and we're going to input the finding. So start off with the risk ID. So we're just going to put 1, as this is the first risk we identified, and then the risk or weakness description. So this is where we take that key finding, and you'll see this first paragraph right here. That is that key finding that we discussed. Privileged accounts are assigned to employees in the IT department. Everybody has a domain admin account, and we haven't separated those privileges across specialized security functions based on their job roles. And then this is where we can use this tool to define what a description of the risk that presents. So we're going to go to the threat listing tab. And here is, when I talked about this risk register being customizable, this is exactly one of the portions that I was more specifically referring to. Based on your organization, you should list all the threats that are applicable to your specific organization. And so these are some threats that we put in here, but you can put whatever threats that you want to put in here. We're going to focus on these ones in yellow for the purpose of today, and that is related to the least privilege not being properly implemented. Okay, so we have here, for example, some different threats are data modification or destruction, damage or destruction of assets, and then digital assets, right? So we might damage the firewall by improperly configuring it, and then data loss or information disclosure, unauthorized access, and then unauthorized changes to the systems. And so changes made to the systems, for example, that aren't tracked or authorized because somebody from the help desk team actually implemented a change that should have taken a domain admin to implement. And because that didn't go through the change management process, now we have an unauthorized change in the environment. Okay. All right, so that's just a quick overview of the threat listing tab. Now we're back on our risk register tab. We talked about our key finding. That's that right there. And then now we're going to focus on what the risk description is based off of this key finding. So this presents a risk that the following could occur. So unauthorized access to systems and sensitive information. So because this help desk admin has the ability to use his domain admin credentials he created, himself an account where he could access HR records and then modify his past performance review, for example. Like he had a poor performance review, he wants to modify that so it doesn't go on his records. Then they would also have unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information, and that could be as a result of the help desk admin getting assigned a task to create a new database. And instead of them creating a brand new database, they take a copy of a database that might have cardholder data on it and they didn't know it. And then they copy that over and then they put it in an environment that doesn't have all the same protection that you would have for the card holder data or that data environment where you have all those protections around protecting that type of information. And so they copy that outside of that protective boundary, and then now that sensitive information that is on that database is now open to being disclosed without appropriate authorization. Then we have the misconfiguration of assets due to a lack of proficiency. So the help desk ticket comes in and a user needs to be able to use a certain software, but the firewall is blocking it. So they submit a request to get that software approved and passed through the firewall. So because that help desk admin has a domain account, they use their domain admin privileges and they go ahead and make that firewall rule because they just want to help that customer or that employee out to be able to do their job, right? They think they're doing a thing, but because they don't have the proficiency necessary to even jump on the firewall, they either misconfigure that or they allow something that might have been on the disapproved list, and because they didn't check it and because they didn't have the experience to even know to check that approved software listing, then they open up the firewall to that software being able to access the system. Last thing is unauthorized changes to the environment. So again, going back to that firewall change, a lot of times modifying a firewall rule is something that requires going through a change approval board of sorts, because that could cause some damage to the organization or cause the firewall to not function properly or things to be let into the environment that shouldn't be in the environment. So a lot of times that goes through an approval process to where you do a security impact analysis and you do a justification and then you review that software listing and we look at the impacts of that firewall rule on other rules that are already in place. Because that person had that domain admin privilege and they didn't have the domain admin knowledge or firewall security engineer knowledge, they made that change because they had the permission to do, but they did not have the requisite knowledge to make a good decision and understand what the right process was. Continuing on through our risk register control ID subcategory, that's just the AC-6 and enhancement 5. So we're going to put that information right there. Implemented controls. If you recall that response that we got from the Chief Information Security Officer when we asked the question of how they are monitoring or managing access and making sure that roles and responsibilities are assigned the appropriate privileges and they're implementing least privilege. This was their response. Access is assigned based off of the employee's work role and then they're assigned to a security group. So that's what that is. That's the implemented controls. Then we're going to look and do an evaluation and analysis on the risk so we can determine what the risk level is. Okay, so let's jump over to our risk matrix tool. And this tab is where we identify likelihood ratings and impact ratings. This we're going to go to because we're going to say this is non-adversarial. So these help desk admins want to do the right thing. They maybe just don't know how. So this might be something that's a mistake. So looking at here, we're going to focus on a qualitative value, but we're going to look over here at the description to determine how bad or how likely is this to happen. So is this error or accident going to occur more than 100 times a year, or is this going to be something that's 10 to 100 times a year, or on the low end, if it's very low, we're probably not going to see this at any point in the next 10 years. Okay. Based off of this, so if a user has elevated privileges beyond which that they need, and we're talking about admins particularly, so how often would they make a mistake? I would say maybe they make a mistake and do a misconfiguration maybe 10 to 100 times a year. So maybe once a month you might have something, or maybe once a week you might have something happen to where somebody does a misconfiguration because they have elevated privileges, but they don't have elevated experience to be able to implement those actions appropriately. So we're going to say from a likelihood perspective, that's going to be a high likelihood that some sort of error or accident is going to take place. And then we're going to look at impact next. And so now, based off of what could happen, what's the impact, right? So catastrophic, for example, would be, hey, like we're going to have to shut our doors to our business because somebody fat fingered a configuration on a firewall. Is that going to be the level of impact, or is it something more along the lines of like major, where it could have an adverse effect on organizational operations, could cause severe degradation and a loss of mission capability? So you put that firewall rule in place, and then it blocks other things because that firewall rule got input on the top of the ACL as opposed to on the bottom or whatever. So I would think that maybe this have somebody having a access to certain privileges would present a major impact to the environment because they could cause a disruption to certain key functions and processes. Probably won't kill the business, but might be a significant disruption. So we're going to take those two values. So we're going to take that high value on the likelihood side. We're going to take the major value on the impact side, and we're going to take this over to our risk matrix. So what you'll notice, there are two on here. We're going to focus again on the qualitative risk matrix over here. And so we look at, and we want to do a cross reference of the likelihood and the impact. So that likelihood rating, we said that was high, right? And then so we're going to take, and so that's this entire row right here is what we're going to focus on. And then on the impact side, we said that was major. So that's this row down here. And so where those intersect, those two is right here in this high. So the risk for this threat or this key finding is high. Now let's jump back over to our risk register tab. And then, so this inherent risk rating, this is where we put high, right? So we use that and we're going to put high in there. And next we want to look, and this is the inherent risk. So if we don't do anything else, this is what the risk is presented to the organization without any controls being in place. Now, maybe we have some implemented controls, compensated controls. Remember we had over here, and we can copy this over, right? So we have some implemented controls that help reduce some of that risk. So at least those regular users are not implementing unauthorized changes because they don't have the permissions. But maybe we also have some compensating controls, like maybe we have MFA on the firewall. So even though you might have a domain admin account, you have to put MFA, and the only way you can get MFA installed is if you have a specific user account. And then maybe you have some logging and monitoring that happens, and so you get an alert or a notification anytime a firewall rule is modified, for example. So that might be an additional compensating control that you have because you don't have different roles segregated within the IT department. Now, so we're going to put those implemented and compensated controls in here. And then based off of that, we might determine that, okay, so that reduces the likelihood because we're going to get an alert if somebody tries to make a firewall rule change and they cannot implement the change on the firewall because even though they have a domain admin account, it's not enrolled in the MFA solution. So that prevents them from accessing that. So maybe this is a moderate risk because at least our firewall is protected in that sense. Okay. Now, then the next item is our remediation recommendations. So these are the recommendations for implementing a plan, different steps in order to improve the security posture. How do we prevent unauthorized changes from happening? So we're going to recommend that we implement appropriate admin accounts that are specific to each role and category position within the IT department. So if there's a help desk admin account, that gets assigned to the help desk admin. They don't get the domain admin account anymore. And then we're only going to assign domain admin privileges to individuals with the domain admin responsibility. So unless they've been hired to be a domain admin or that's part of their roles and responsibilities, then we're not going to give them that domain admin privilege. We're not going to put their user account in that domain admin group or their privileged account in that domain admin group. Next is the risk treatment. So this is where we're going to identify how we're going to address this. And because we want to mitigate this, we're going to select mitigate, but you have the option to accept the risk. I'm like, hey, we're not going to do anything about it. We don't have time to adjust these. We're just going to keep it as a domain admin. We can have a void where we're just not going to do any permissions whatsoever. We're not going to do business. So we're going to avoid this altogether. Nobody gets any user accounts. Nobody has access to information. Not a likely solution in this sense. And then you have transfer. This is where you may hire cyber insurance or obtain cyber insurance, for example. And if something catastrophic were to happen, hey, we'll file a claim and then the insurance provider comes in and then they come and save the day. So we've transferred the risk over to them. All we do is pay our premium or our deductible. We're going to put this back on mitigate, and then we're going to assign a point of contact. Somebody needs to be assigned the responsibility of making sure that these remediation recommendations get implemented. And so that's going to be the IT director in this sense. And then we're going to assign a date where we identify this. So maybe we did a risk assessment on the 22nd of August, and that's where I identified that we don't have the appropriate least privilege implemented. And then schedule completion date. This is when we plan on implementing this change, all these over here in the risk recommendations. All of these things, this is whenever we get complete with all those tasks, that's going to be our scheduled completion date. But then we're going to have actual completion date because we want to come back and review on the 1st of September or afterwards to see if those things are put in place. If they did, we're going to put the actual completion date in, and then we're going to mark this as complete. So right now it's not complete. So we're going to put this as maybe it's in progress. Maybe they're in discussion on how they need to do this. So maybe this is in progress, but you got all these different statuses on here: not started, in progress, complete, on hold, or unknown. Hey, we just haven't made a decision on this, so we're still trying to figure it out. We're going to put this back on in progress. And then lastly, the notes. So if you have any additional feedback, notes, or considerations, you're going to put that in this section. For example, if you set a scheduled completion date of the 1st of September, but your domain admin that is actually going to be implementing these changes, right? So they're going to be assigning and creating these new security groups. Maybe that person got sick and they had to get hospitalized. And so they were hospitalized up until the 5th of September and they weren't able to get this done until the 7th of September. There's a deviation between the actual completion date and the scheduled completion date. So we need to explain what that is so that if we have a meeting on the 3rd of September, we can say, hey, our domain admin that is going to be implementing these changes in the Azure or the Active Directory environment is out on sick leave. And so once they get back, then we will go and proceed with this plan to implement these, and then we'll update the actual completion date once we're done. So this is where you put that extra feedback and extra information in. So now let's talk about how we do ongoing review and monitoring of risks. So once we've documented these risks, we filled out this risk register, you got to regularly review it. You can't just stick this in a corner somewhere and never look at it again and just put it in the filing system, and then you don't see the risk register again until you do your next annual risk assessment, right? So organizations, GRC practitioners, we have to continuously monitor risk as a whole on an organization and keeping our eyes and ears open. So as we're doing vulnerability scans, we're adding to this risk register. As we identify new risks, we're adding to that risk register, and then we're going to periodically report on these risks so that we maintain visibility on the risk status. So are we still in progress, or has this been completed? Is this delayed in any way, shape, or form? What is the effectiveness of our mitigation plan? Did the action steps that we outlined, did that actually work, or was there additional work that needed to take place? And then the responsible point of contact, we want to make sure that they still are remaining open about what is happening with the risk that is in their area of concern. And then if they need any additional resources, maybe we need to hire an additional security engineer that is trained on firewall rules, because we keep having these issues where these changes happen and they're not properly reviewed, they're not properly vetted, because that person doesn't have the proper experience level. So how do we engage with a point of contact to make sure that this risk is addressed appropriately? Lastly, when we talk about periodically reporting, we want to make sure that this risk register is managed or reviewed or presented to the executive management or a senior leader so that these risks stay front of mind and that we keep track of these risks as we go through the process of bringing them down, implementing a strategy of mitigation so that the risk can get brought down to an acceptable level for the organization. So you want to schedule these periodic reports, whether this is a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly report, but something needs to happen in terms of communicating what is going on with the risks that have been identified within the organization so that we can track these and then make sure that we go and resolve these in a reasonable amount of time. Thank you for watching this walkthrough of the Better Everyday Cyber Risk Register template. I know you got value in this tool and that it'll be able to help you document, track, and help manage identified risk in any organization. For those of you that are part of one of our courses or programs, you can find a copy of the Risk Register template in the lesson resources. Now, for those of you that are not already part of one of our programs or courses, don't worry. You can download a free copy of this Risk Register template by simply clicking on the link in the show notes below or by visiting www.bettereverydaycyber.com and going to the resources tab. Lastly, if you're watching us on YouTube and you got value out of this video, go ahead and smash that like button, share, and subscribe. Until next time, go forth and do great things.